Now, as an individual grows older, they become more capable of understanding what death is and being able to deal with their own impending death. The shift from formal operational to this post-formal stage of thinking, which is something I've described in a previous video, this occurs around the age of teens to early 20s, helps people to integrate their emotions and their thoughts about the subject of death. Around the same time, and as they move towards middle age, a lot of individuals will start experiencing the death of loved ones. And this helps them reflect on their own life and their own mortality as well. And as they grow older, as an individual approaches middle age and the elder years, typically their death anxiety, their fear of dying, will diminish. We generally see that over time, but we'll talk about these kinds of things in another video. What I wanted to focus here on was how the individual faces their own death. But there's a lot of different ways an individual could die, and as a result, it makes the most sense to consider death as a trajectory, not an end state. So, in other words, some forms of death have a trajectory that is quite slow and gradually builds, so you can have some time to respond to that death. So this red line would be an example of that. A lot of the times when an individual is diagnosed with cancer, they're given many years to live their life before they will unfortunately die. But this isn't always the case. In some cases, that trajectory is much more steep of an incline. A person might be diagnosed with some kind of heart condition, but they don't really know how big of a problem it is until suddenly they have a severe heart problem and it kills them. So in a condition like that, it could also be many years, but they just never know exactly when it's coming. So it can be much more traumatic as a result. And then there's other diseases and other causes of death, of course, that just pretty much kill the person instantly. They really don't have any time to prepare. They don't have any time to react. As soon as they realize they're dying, it's basically over at that point. And this is one of the reasons why people were so freaked out about the Ebola virus back in the day. It does kill very quickly, unfortunately. But people who do have time to prepare, any amount of time, whether it's minutes, days, or years, they will typically react in certain ways. This comes from research done by an individual named Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. She pioneered the study of the different stages of the dying process with her 1960s interviews with terminally ill patients. Now, these terminally ill patients, they didn't always know they were dying, but most of them did have some kind of suspicion of that. Like they could tell that their condition was not getting better. And what she noted in their reactions to this was 5 distinct emotions. Now, these 5 emotions, they do typically happen in a certain order, but they can overlap and unfold in any order. And there's a lot of individual differences as well. Like one person might get stuck on stage 1, whereas another person might just, be fast-tracked into stage 5, depending on a number of factors, like their social environment, their personality, their belief system. So there's a lot of different things that can manipulate how these different stages affect the person and in what order. But the stages are, number 1, denial. So most people, when they realize that they're going to die, they go into the state of denial, the state of shock and disbelief, where they just can't accept the fact that their death is inevitable. They'll oftentimes withdraw from friends and family, they'll withdraw from doctors, and they'll reject any information that confirms that their death is going to occur. But that denial typically doesn't last very long because, you can't reject everything. There is something that's going to remind you that you're going to die eventually, and that leads to stage 2 of anger, where the person will start lashing out at these reminders of their impending death. They'll become very hostile and resentful. They'll start asking in an angry way, why is this happening to me and not you? Like, a lot of times that anger is projected onto survivors. Like, maybe they were in a car crash and they're the only one who was terminally injured or terminally wounded, and now they are very hostile towards the people who weren't terminally injured. But if they have some time to work through that anger, generally that's going to fade away. No strong emotion can last forever, so eventually the anger is going to fade away and they'll move into stage 3, which is what she called bargaining. Now, I don't really like to call it bargaining because that implies that you're trying to make a deal. And that's not exactly how this works. What stage 3 should be called is escape. You're trying to find an escape. You're trying to cheat death in some way, looking for a way out. So this could be, after you've tried all the standard medical treatments, this could involve taking a tour of the world and trying all kinds of different spiritual and alternative treatments, just trying any kind of, thing that may have a chance of potentially helping you. This is actually something that a lot of individuals do. You could call it like a medical tour. And it's kind of sad because obviously a lot of these individuals, they aren't going to get any good treatments in this way, and that will lead them to stage 4 of depression, where they'll just kind of stop trying. They'll stop trying to escape, they'll stop being hostile, they'll stop trying to deny it, and they'll just stop in general. They just don't want to do anything with their life anymore. They feel a lot of sorrow, a lot of loss, guilt, and shame. Oftentimes they feel like a burden on their loved ones, and they just want their death to come immediately, typically. And the sad thing is, for a lot of individuals who are going through these stages of dying, they will get to depression, but then that's where they stop. They don't move to the 5th and final stage of acceptance. So why exactly people don't reach acceptance? It's hard to say. It could be a personality thing, it could be religious beliefs, but for whatever the reason, a lot of times people won't be able to reach stage 5 unless they have plenty of time to prepare for their death. So if their death has that kind of slow trajectory, then they will be able to accept its inevitability and approach these final years, days, or minutes of their life with peace and detachment. And simply just enjoy what time they have remaining. Now, this is just me speculating, but the ability to reach acceptance might have to do with the person's degree of death anxiety. Now, death anxiety refers to the feeling or anxiety a person has about death and dying. So I'm not talking about any particular form of death, I'm just talking about death in general, like the state of not being alive. And it's normal to have some degree of death anxiety. A lot of the phobias, a lot of the anxieties that we naturally have, they do help to keep us safe and healthy and alive. But with any healthy anxiety, that can be taken to the extreme and become a disorder. So there are such things as like anxiety disorders for topics like death. But most people don't have those kinds of issues. Most people have just perfectly normal levels of death anxiety, and we generally see that younger individuals have it more so than older. So the younger a person is, the more death anxiety they tend to have. And when a younger individual with a high amount of death anxiety looks at an elder, what they often do is they see themselves, especially if the person is similar to themselves, like a relative or somebody of the same gender and ethnicity. Like they see themselves growing old and dying when they look at elders, and it causes them to feel an inordinate amount of death anxiety. So yeah, older adults do tend to represent existential threats to younger adults. They just see themselves growing old and frail. Now, typically, we do see an interesting gender difference as well. Men tend to be more fearful of death, being not alive, whereas women tend to be more fearful of dying, the process of transitioning into death. Why exactly we see this gender difference, it's not very easy to say, but it's something I'll touch on a little bit more in another video. The basic idea is, when we see these kinds of gender differences, it seems that women put more emphasis on how their actions, in this case their death, affects those around them. Now, there are ways that we can measure an individual's death anxiety. One popular way is using what we call terror management theory. This is this idea that people engage in behaviors to achieve particular psychological states based on their deeply rooted concerns about mortality. In other words, we can see what the person does, what the person is willing to do in order to preserve their safety, to preserve their life. And the whole idea here is that what they're doing is they're trying to ensure the continuation of their life. That's like their primary motivation for every action they take. So some people, they're going to respond to any potential threat with a large amount of, activity. They would obviously have a high amount of death anxiety. Whereas an older individual who typically has less death anxiety, they would be less quick to react and they would take less thorough action. You could think of numerous examples of this, but another comedian that I watch a lot of stand-up comedians apparently. This comedian I was watching was describing how people of different ages back out of a parking lot. Like if a person's in their young adult life, they're going to be looking back and forth like this and constantly checking and turning around. But once the time you get to about 70 or 80 years of age, you just kind of say to yourself, yep, I'm going back. And then you step on the gas. Like you don't even look. You don't even care. Like if you get hit, who cares? So obviously, that's just a joke, but that does pretty clearly illustrate what I mean by saying that elders have less death anxiety and they go to less extremes to preserve their lives as a result. But death really is an interesting subject, in my opinion. I like to do research on death and to talk about death because it is something that is unique in the human neurophysiology. We've done a lot of neuroimaging studies, and they've typically shown that similar to how love is a special pattern of activity in the brain, death is another special pattern of activity. So whenever people think about death, their brain goes into a different mode of thinking, so to speak. But if you are one of these younger adults and you do have a huge amount of death anxiety, I just want to provide you some advice from the research on how to deal with it. So a lot of these ideas you've probably already heard in one form or another, but one of the big ones is to focus on what you have, to enjoy what you have. Don't spend a lot of time thinking about what you may have had or what you have lost in the past, like maybe you made a big mistake in one of your previous relationships and you have a lot of bad feelings about it. Just try not to focus on that stuff. You can't go back in time. Time travel like that is not possible. Well, at least so far, nobody's developed a time machine like that. So there's nothing you could do about it, right? So no regrets, right? Just move on. Just think about the future, focus on what you have. Another thing that comes from the research is that you want to try to avoid getting those regrets in the first place. Think about what you want in life and take risks. Of course, you don't want to take risks that could lead to an early end to your life, but to put it simply, you only live once, right? To always be playing it safe, you're going to probably miss out on a lot of things that you wish you hadn't. But yeah, stay safe. You only live once, but you don't want to make it a short life, right? Another thing you can do to reduce your death anxiety is to increase your death awareness. So what I mean by that is just think about your death. Plan your death. Maybe like write an obituary or plan your funeral. Just spend a lot of time reflecting on what it would be like if you were to die. Like, what would you want to happen? How would you want people to respond? So if you plan ahead like that, it can help to deal with that anxiety to a certain degree. But perhaps one of the most effective ways to deal with death anxiety is through being involved in death education programs. So whenever you are presented with factual information about death and dying and the complex emotions that are involved, that can just help you to get a better understanding of what death is and what to expect when it occurs to you. To put it in another way, by watching videos like this, by taking courses like human development where we talk about death, you are becoming more prepared